Greetings, everyone. My name is Peter Young, and I'm a member of the Committee 100, and I also chair of this Committee 100 Asian American Career Ceilings initiative. I'm also the CEO of Young Partners, a international investment bank. Uh, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this session. This is somewhat of an unusual session because this is sort of like a repeat of a series, like in Netflix, in that we originally had the program with the two gentlemen here on April 27th. But because we had so many questions and so many people attending, we realized that we had run out of time to go through the questions. Actually, there were 102 chats, which not all were questions, but a large number were. So our objective today is we will start with a brief summary of some of the key points that were made on April 27th. But we'll try to endeavor essentially to do two things. One is to answer many of the questions that were posed by many of you on April 27th. And we'll do that for about 30 minutes. Many of you, by the way, are attended last time. So hopefully, if you submitted questions, yours will be answered. But we still want to leave some time at the end for new questions from the audience. So we'll roughly have a 5-minute introduction, about a 30-minute rendition of the answers to the April 27th questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. I do want to comment about the program and future events, but before I do, I want to just remind you that the best way for you to ask questions is to use the chat function. And I think everyone is familiar with that. And basically, if you can click on it, type in your question, that would be the best way for the panelists to be able to see the questions. Last, I just want to say that this series has been a very exciting series. And when we first started it in February of 2020, we didn't expect to have as many people interested, attending, or as many topics that people would find valuable. But this is, I believe, the 14th one since February of 2020. And I think we'll continue to do these as long as we have speakers and topics that people find interesting. Just for your information, 503 people registered for this event, and obviously not all will attend, but that's probably a good measure of how what the interest level is in this topic. Lastly, I want to say that we have at least 2 events coming up. On June 22nd, I believe, we will have one on women in corporation, and we'll have Jenny Ming, who is quite famous, who started and ran some major retail stores, and also Deb Liu, who was a very senior person at Facebook and is now head of Ancestry.com. So we have 2 very successful women who are also Committee 100 members, but they'll talk about the experiences they went through, but also what they perceive in their industry sectors, and they're quite different. One is high tech, and one is retail, which is, by the way, Jenny Ming would start at Old Navy, which I think all of us recognize that. And then last, on July 17th, we're going to have somewhat of a different format, in that we're going to have a sort of a discussion, dialogue, town hall on the overall topic of what more can we do? What more can we do in terms of things that are already in place that people are working on, but also what new things, initiatives can we take? It's going to be unique because all of you who attend are essentially going to be the ones involved. Because after a short panel at the start with a couple of people who are heads of a couple of these organizations, we'll move on to divide you all into tables in discussion groups to really discuss the topic. And at the end, a discussion leader from each table will get up and summarize the 3 or 4 really the best ideas that came up on their table. So this is a very exciting kind of format, and we hope all of you have the opportunity to participate. With that, we have, again, 2 prominent researchers on this topic. Michael Morris, who is a professor at Columbia Business School, and Jackson Liu, who is at the MIT Sloan School. And the 2 of them have done an immense amount of work, 9 different research studies, really to focus on this issue of what drives the whole career ceiling for Asian Americans. And we'll start out by allowing Michael to summarize some of the key points that were covered on April 27th, and then they'll move immediately into answering many of the questions from April 27th, and then to answer your new questions today. So Michael, go ahead.
Thank you, Peter, and thank all of you for your interest. It's a real privilege for Jackson Liu and myself to share our research, because you are the real experts on the topic, the people who've lived it. We started with the question of, aren't Asians doing just fine? Aren't they the model minority? And the answer is yes, they are, but not necessarily in leadership. There's a gap in leadership. There's a so-called career ceiling. It's certainly not absolute, and a lot of you all are exceptions to the rule. You are all extremely successful people, but some of your peers have faced this career ceiling. So that's not news to you, but as social scientists, Jackson and I thought we could contribute by trying to empirically measure the phenomenon and look at its scope and look at its causal mechanism. That's sort of the two questions that a social scientist takes when you want to understand a phenomenon. So if we're thinking about the scope of it, we asked ourselves, is it an Asian phenomenon that affects everyone from Asia, as the label, bamboo ceiling might suggest, or is it more specific? So we focused on 2 broad groups, South Asians and East Asians, defining South Asians as, the subcontinent, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, and East Asia's, China, Japan, Korea. And we compared in various kinds of studies, samples of East Asians and South Asians and then non-Asians. And what we observed repeatedly with different kinds of methods is that the career ceiling, the sort of gap in representation in the executive ranks, seems to affect East Asians more than South Asians. What's really startling and new in our results is the finding that South Asians seem to be doing even better than whites on average in some of these leadership things, which if you look at the CEOs on Wall Street and the CEOs in the tech industry, maybe isn't that much of a surprise. It's something that's been hiding in plain sight. And then the question is why? So looking at mechanisms of this problem, what we do is we try to measure lots of variables about people and see how they're correlated with those particular person's experience of career ceilings. And some of the horses in the race that we investigated was this idea that perhaps East Asians or Asians are more interested in technical prowess and not so interested in holding an executive role, or not, or not as high in their aspirations. So we kind of, those, you may think that's not even worth investigating, but some people have expressed those ideas. So we took various measures of people's aspirations, work motivation, leadership goals, and we repeatedly found no difference across the groups in that, or sometimes Asians look even higher than whites. Asians certainly care more about success than whites do in surveys. So then the other thing that we looked at was measures of verbal assertiveness. And it's a very kind of specific concept. Verbal assertiveness means that you kind of have a taste for engaging in debate, that you're comfortable expressing a view in public, that you can, push an idea and have sort of constructive conflict around the idea. So it's a thing that we measure sometimes via self-report by asking questions of that sort. Sometimes we measure it by asking peers, how verbally assertive are these employees or these managers? And we consistently find that verbal assertiveness is the causal mechanism identified by the correlations in our research. And of course, the research has limitations, and we have lots of excellent questions from you about that. We also looked in some ways at the variable of prejudice, and we found the somewhat surprising finding that the level of prejudice against South Asians is higher than East Asians, at least when we did the research pre-COVID. We know these things are in flux. So as best we can tell, it's primarily an East Asian issue, and it's primarily running through levels of verbal assertiveness, in the workplace. And that's where we left off last week. And then we got lots of really great questions about the research and about future directions. And we'd like to take those on now.
And I believe that Michael, you and Jackson have sorted through all those questions and picked out the ones to go through. So I'll let you sort of work your way through the questions that you thought made sense to try to address.
Well, why don't we do this, Jackson? I'll read the question, and then you take the first stab at answering it. I do the easy work. You do the more. You're the lead author, right? So you get the hard job. So I put these questions in categories. There were about 30 actual questions, in addition to many long, interesting comments. So the questions we sorted into categories, and the first set of questions are questions about nuances in the results, about details of the results that we didn't really talk about much last time. So the first question from Sue-Ann Hong is, was there a breakdown by gender in your studies? Were there any effects that differed by gender? Jackson?
Yes, I would say that's a great question. And that's clearly a question that we cared a lot about. So we actually explored in each of our 9 studies. And what we saw was that the results are actually a bit mixed, right? So in some studies, we see that East Asian women and East Asian men, and they do sort of equally bad in terms of leadership representation. But in some other study, we see that East Asian women actually are particularly underrepresented in leadership attainment, which perhaps is not surprising given that we know from previous research, a lot of research was suggesting that women face this glass ceiling. So in a sense, East Asian women would sometimes face basically a double bind, right? So being both East Asian and women. So, but as I said, the results are mixed. So we're interested in exploring further.
Yeah, I would also note that assertiveness also tends to be a variable that comes up in research on gender. So right. It may be that there's 2 contributors to lower assertiveness, one being female, one being East Asian. And it's also worth noting that in some of the research on leadership attainment or career ceilings among ethnic minorities in the United States, women do better than men. So some of the studies on African Americans find that African American women have succeeded at higher rates than African American men. I think most of the studies on East Asians find things pretty close to us, what we found, which is that East Asian women are doing about as well as East Asian men. Okay. The next one about nuances in the results. This is from Harrison Lung. He says, how much of the South Asian, East Asian difference is driven by objective facts, the job title that somebody holds, as opposed to mindset or self-perception, feeling that you are a leader? Jackson?
Yes, another great question, right? So about this idea of driven by facts or mindsets. What we see is, so first of all, I think we acknowledge that mindset can definitely play a role, the way they report, for example, when they answer the question, are you in a senior role and so on. But as Michael mentioned, we did a series of nice studies. And in some studies, the measurement of leadership attainment is actually objective, right? So for example, our first study where we looked at the archival data of S&P 500 CEOs, and we just literally counted who is the CEO and so on, right? So there we have objective data at the highest level of US corporate leadership. We consistently see that East Asians are underrepresented and actually South Asians are overrepresented, or as I should say, better represented than whites once we accounted for their CEO to population ratio. And also in our MBA study where, for example, we looked at MBA students who started the program without any leaders, any assigned leaders, right? We looked at leadership election and see which MBA students actually got elected to become the cluster chair, the social chair, and so on. And again, we saw a clear difference where South Asians did quite well and East Asians were underrepresented.
It is a finding well known in the literature on like 360 performance data, where each manager rates themselves and is also rated by their peers. That in the West, you tend to see a self-enhancing bias where I think I'm a little better than my peers think I am. And in East Asia, you see a modesty bias where managers will rate themselves a little bit lower than their peers rate them. So that subjective thing is a very real phenomenon, but it's not the whole enchilada that we are just seeing in our research, because we see it.
Absolutely. And I should add that, so what I talked about was leadership attainment, right? For assertiveness, also, as Michael mentioned, we had 360 ratings. We had people self-report, and we see that East Asians are more likely to report being lower on assertiveness. But we also had other reports, right? Other ratings. And again, we see that East Asians were rated as significantly less assertive than, for example, South Asians.
All right, another question about nuances in the results. This is from Drayton Thomas, and Drayton asks, within the many other factors that you controlled for, such as English fluency, immigration status, like first generation, second generation, third generation, did any of these factors stand out as additionally important drivers of leadership attainment?
Yes. So first of all, I want to thank Drayton, the person clearly listened carefully to our talk last time, where we said, indeed, we controlled for English fluency and immigration status, whether you're first generation, whether you're international and so on. We consistently found, for example, East Asians, even for East Asians born in the United States, they're still less likely to attain leadership than South Asians born in the United States, right? Suggesting that English fluency or immigration status, they don't just count for the so-called bamboo seeding, the gap between East Asians and South Asians. And to answer the question more directly, indeed, we did see that English fluency and also being born in the United States both positively predicted leadership attainment. And that's above and beyond the differences, for example, the ethnic differences, which is to say all these factors matter, as you would expect.
Yeah, it's a lot of the people who try to think of alternative explanations for our phenomenon, they naturally go to the fact that, India has some similarities to the United States that, say, China doesn't have, one being that English is a widespread language and has been for generations. And then some of you asked about other things, but we'll get to those other things. The next category of questions.
Michael, perhaps before we move on, we could address some of similar questions in the chat, because I noticed there are some similar methodological questions in the chat about how we did the study. And perhaps a good idea, afterwards or in between, maybe Peter or Mike, we can post the link to the paper, because I think the paper clearly details, we have a 70-page supplemental materials and also the actual paper that would answer some of the questions, just in case you still have other questions. So for example, Cynthia asked, have you included educational attainment of the two groups? Absolutely. In each of our studies, where possible, we controlled for their age, education. I think someone else here asked about demographic factors such as age, gender, and so on. So where possible, in each of our studies, we controlled for these factors. And again, we see the leadership discrepancy above and beyond, even after we controlled for these, right? So for example, for education, in some of our field studies with organizations, we statistically controlled for people's individuals' educational attainment, the highest level of education. And then in our MBA studies, obviously everyone was attending the same business school, so the same education level.
By the way, there was one question asked, which was, is there any access to the video of the last broadcast, the last webcast? And the answer to that is yes. And we distributed that link to the people who registered last time, but we'll be happy to distribute it to everyone who registered this time, so you can watch, like Netflix, right? The series, you can watch the April 27th and then roll over to the June 8th one, right?
Yes. And also, I just posted the link to our paper published in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences in the chat, in case people have further questions about the methodological details.
Good. Now, the majority of the questions were about other topics that could be studied, other things that could be investigated. And I want to come to that last, because I think that sort of is the most open-ended topic. But the next category that sort of follows from the studies that we did is what interventions are specifically suggested by our findings, which suggest that assertiveness is a key conduit, for this leadership difference to come into effect. So there's a question from, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing anybody's name, but Gang Zhu says maybe there's a problem in the West's or the United States definition of leadership, its style and its attributes. And so the intervention shouldn't be changing the behavior or habits of East Asian managers. It should be changing the organizations that are not promoting them. Jackson, what do you have to say about that?
Yes, I think what Michael and I would say, our view is that this is always a two-sided problem, right? So we should not blame the victim. We should not blame East Asians. We think it's a two-sided problem. So from the organization side, we think the onus of breaking the bamboo ceiling shouldn't fall on East Asians themselves, right? Maybe we should start with the organization, even though things might not change overnight. So we think American organizations should evolve the implicit approach type of leadership to maybe fit an increasingly diversifying workforce. And just to recognize that being assertive leader, being assertive, is not the only successful leadership style, right? So perhaps American organizations can benefit from East Asian sort of group-focused, protection-oriented leadership style. Listening is certainly important, while even though we know assertiveness, sharing your opinions, voicing your opinions is also important. And I think by appreciating diverse leadership styles, American organizations can better leverage East Asian leader talent, especially as Michael mentioned, our research shows that East Asians are equally interested in leadership roles. They're equally motivated by leadership positions. Anything you would like to add, Paul?
Yeah, we think that there may well be a sort of time lag between the efficacy of leadership styles and the expectation of those leadership styles in organizations. So as someone who's not Asian and who's fairly assertive, I am constantly being told these days that my leadership should be less assertive because of the younger Gen Z and millennials who don't like to feel safe, et cetera, rather than having, like really vigorous debates in meetings, et cetera. So when I see sort of the leadership style that's called for to address the younger generation, it looks a lot like the East Asian leadership style. So it may be that you're right, that the organizations need to adjust their notion of what leadership looks like based on what's really effective today. Okay, the next question from Chen Chen. How do East Asians grow their assertiveness from, from the time that they're young kids to the time that they're professionals developing themselves? So do we know anything about ways to increase assertiveness?
A very important question. So far, we haven't exactly looked at sort of precise interventions to help East Asian grow assertiveness. And again, I think organizations here should play an important role rather than just leaving East Asians, on themselves to figure out how to grow assertiveness. But we can imagine, for example, organizations can organize communication workshops, and East Asians can be encouraged to speak up in meetings, in classrooms, starting from young kids, right? They could even, if they recognize that potentially their cultural background might, for example, might be detrimental or might impede their leadership progress, they can actively seek opportunities, for example, to join debate club or try stand-up comedy, or even simply tell themselves, well, before I walk into a meeting, tell myself, okay, today at least I will ask one question, or at least I will speak up once. I think those things would be a great start.
Good. Okay. Final question about interventions. This is from Wei Gan. And this is a challenging question, and I think a really good one. The question is, the study seems to be suggesting that if only East Asians would speak up more, like their South Asian brethren, then all these anti-Asian discrimination issues would be resolved. But really, would addressing this one single factor make the inequality go away?
I agree with Michael. It is a great question. Since I was talking all the time, would you like to take, or I can give it a
I'm
shot?
happy to do it. I don't want to put all of it on you. I think
Sounds good.
It's a great question, because intervention science is a whole game of its own. What Jackson and I do basic research. So we're looking for what is the mediating variable statistically that would seem to be the causal factor. And generally the causal factor is the target of the intervention. But the world is a little more complicated than just a set of mechanisms that add up to each other. Sometimes the mechanisms are interrelated and hydraulic, so that if you fix this, then this becomes an even bigger problem. And for example, in the literature on gender and career ceilings, the first wave of advice was, well, that women should be more assertive. They should speak up more. They should be more demanding when they're negotiating. And the finding that came out was that, well, a lot of the times when women do act more assertive, they're punished for that much more than a man would be for the same behavior. So the same behavior by a woman comes across as short-sighted and pushy, whereas from a man it comes across as, well, he really has conviction in his skills. So this is often referred to as the double bind. Like, you can be feminine and then you don't get a raise, or you can act less feminine, but then people think that you shouldn't be allowed to interact with clients because you're strident. And so the question here, drawing the analogy, if East Asian employees who weren't formally that assertive started acting assertive all of a sudden one day, would people notice it quite a bit and push back against it? And then there's a different question, which is, if a new rising generation of East Asians is more assertive, would people notice and would people push back? And I think certainly for the first one, when a person changes overnight, they're probably going to have a surprise factor, and they're going to have people like, whoa, you're certainly speaking up a lot lately. But generationally, certainly there's in my experience, working with a lot of, I've worked with a lot of East Asian graduate students. Jackson's a lot different from the students I worked with 20 years ago. So I think that, generationally, there may be an increase in assertiveness that doesn't carry with it backlash because it doesn't stand out because it's part of a generational phenomenon.
I'll make one short comment, and that is, I don't know if you know, but we actually had a webcast which was the millennial perspective.
Good.
And we had 4 millennials, different genders, et cetera, different careers as a panelist. But the interesting thing is before that, we did a broad survey of all the people who registered. And we made them ask a number of questions. And it was very interesting because some of the things we tried to see is, was there a difference in response by age group? Did millennials or people who are advanced in their careers feel differently to different genders? And it really, a lot of the points really support, Michael, what you're saying, about gender differences and so forth. So I'll share some of that with you. It's not a scientific study, but it was an interesting survey of all the people who registered.
Interesting to know. Yeah, I mean, it's really impressive how in this speaker series you've covered so many facets of the issue by hearing close commentary from people who are living that, and that is really insight producing to those of us who do research on it. All right, the next sort of category of questions that I think follows are some really interesting questions about advocacy. And I know a lot of you are in the role, formally or informally, as advocates, as people pushing your organization for more representation of East Asians in leadership, or, you working on political campaigns with East Asian candidates, or one or another form of advocacy. And so questions were asked about what our findings suggest for advocates. Sandy Shu says, how can one productively engage in advocating for programs for East Asians to advance in the workforce, given the political climate today? For example, I've witnessed certain attempts where the organization will attribute East Asians' lack of leadership representation as something they need to pick up themselves with no organizational interest in helping. And maybe in some industries, a notion that Asians are overrepresented. So what are effective ways to make this case? I think it's, it's a little different than, I'll give one answer, then Jackson, you can suggest what you think about this. I think that if I were an advocate for, say, Hispanic representation in the tech industry, I would focus a lot on the pipeline. Like, do we have enough people starting in entry-level jobs so that there's a decent chance that some of them will rise to the top? If I were advocating on behalf of East Asians, I might not have that same focus because, it is probably the case that East Asians are proportionally overrepresented in a lot of these desirable industries relative to their representation in the population. But their advancement is underrepresented relative to their representation in the initial jobs, and in my view, underrepresented relative to their performance, because I think in a lot of the tech companies I know, the most important innovations have come from East Asians, but East Asians are not in the C-suite. So I think it's a different focus. It's a focus on not on, we're trying to, it's certainly not, for example, like the kind of thing where we're demanding special quotas, for hiring our group, because our group is already being hired because we're talented, right? But what we're demanding is something very different, which is when leadership decisions are made, they should be made based on documented performance and talent, not based on stereotypes about who's a good leader. Jackson, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think Michael's points are fantastic. I completely agree. In addition, I would add that sometimes the idea is that sort of Asians, they are assumed to be this model minority doing just fine, because most visibly people sort of interact day to day. They see, there are a lot of, East Asians in cafeterias. I can see a lot of East Asians, right? So thriving. So what are you talking about? Or they see data objectively, look, East Asians, they have high median income, right? So they're not really facing challenges. They're doing just fine. I think precisely because Asians are perceived as the model minority doing just fine, right? Sometimes the challenges can be overlooked. So it's important for us, for people in the audience, for us researchers to really promote and just show the actual statistics, right? For example, our research actually shows this career ceiling faced by East Asians. And a lot of the senior managers, the CEOs, they may be vaguely aware of this, but they can choose not to listen. But if you show them real statistics, like, look, we have East Asians are quite well represented at the entry level, but you don't see them in our company, we don't see them here. And then I think the conversation can really start, right? And also, because we see that, as Michael mentioned, our research shows that sometimes in some settings, South Asians are actually better represented than whites. And then demographically, if organization HRs lump all groups together, then sometimes this career ceiling faced by East Asians might actually be hidden, right? So it's actually only when you break down those two groups, then you see these striking gaps. And so it's very important for organizations to recognize that, look, Asians are not just a single monolithic group. We need to recognize some of the cultural differences, and the different Asian subgroups might face unique challenges. So I think that's sort of a really important starting point.
And that's great. Make your arguments based on data, because the data is your friend. The data, makes the case very eloquently on its own without any social justice rationales needed, just in terms of organizational efficiency. Okay, next question about advocacy and the challenges involved. And again, this is a great question, and it's one that we deal with every day, which is from Catherine's son. It seems easy to take these findings and say, aha, cultural stereotypes are true. Chinese people are meek and Indians are argumentative. How does one navigate and interpret these findings without devolving into these gross simplifications? It's a great question. I feel nervous every time I talk to a public group about these findings, because there's a tendency to speak in shorthand and to say East Asians are X, South Asians are Y, instead of saying there is a statistical tendency for East Asians to experience this and a tendency for South Asians to experience that. So it's only a stereotype when you're assuming that it's uniform and that it's rigid and that there's something pejorative about it. And but to say that there's a group difference, that's not a stereotype. The stereotype comes when you put it on an individual in a way that's limiting to them. So I guess it's not easy though, because we speak in shorthand.
Right.
So do you have a way to stop yourself from sounding like you're speaking in stereotypes when you talk about this?
I agree with Michael. It's certainly a tough question, right? So, and stereotypes are hard to change. As Michael mentioned, women face the double bind, and I think sometimes East Asians certainly also face the double bind, right? When they don't speak up, they don't get noticed, they don't get promoted to leadership positions. When they're too assertive, when they do speak up, people say, well, you're too assertive for East Asians. And I think in my personal experience, what I found, and I don't know if it's been working for me, I find that humor never hurts, right? Interject a sense of humor here and there could ease some of the tension and show that you have good intention. You're not trying to be abrasive, you're not trying to be aggressive. And so I think humor is always a nice lubricant in conversations, and to just assure people that I'm not aggressive, I don't have bad intention. I think that could help.
Mm-hmm. So that goes back to your recommendation about stand-up comedy, right, Jackson?
Yes, 2 birds in 1 stone. Practicing humor and communication assertiveness.
A person we mentioned last time is Andrew Yang. It was salient to me because I'm in New York. I think Peter also, and he's neck and neck in the mayoral race. And I think when he was running for president, he did quite well on the debate stage. And there's a group of us at Columbia who teach a course on communication, and we also do some coaching of politicians. And one of the fellows here was involved in Yang's campaign in a public role. But Yang also also is a really funny guy, and he engaged in some spontaneous humor. And I think, I think in the Asian community, there was a mixed response to that, because if you just see some of the jokes he made, out of context, it may seem like he's, playing off of stereotypes. But I think he was expressing that, like, he's a flexible guy, and that he's not limited in the way that you think he might be. And so I think it was effective for him. But humor is, ethnic humor that makes reference to cultural stereotypes is always a dangerous thing. Even if it looks good at the time, it may be dangerous later on. So humor about other subjects, maybe self-deprecating as opposed to group-deprecating humor, is a better recipe. Okay, then the next question, the final one of about advocacy, and this one comes from Charlene Collins. And I'm not 100% sure I'm getting it right, because I think maybe some words got cut off here, but it's a reference to the current rise of anti-Chinese sentiment. And could something like this be an impediment to advocacy? And of course, this is an empirical question. We did our research a year ago, or 2 years. The actual data was collected 2 or 3 years ago, so we don't know exactly how the current phenomenon that we see in a very sort of disgusting way, with attacks on elderly Asians on the streets, is that phenomenon relevant to what managers would experience in the workplace? I'm not certain that it is. I'm not certain that there is a global sense of anti-Chinese feeling, but it may just be that in the very margins of society, and especially people who are not mentally 100%, that somehow this is a rise in anti-Chinese sentiment among a very small part of the population. Any thoughts about this or speculation about this, Jackson?
I would say, if I understood the question correctly, what I would say is, and I'm thinking on the spot, right? If, for example, some of you have a laptop and you can just Google, you look at a Google trend, I wonder if, for example, the mention of Asian, or if you look at Google Books and so on, Google Ngrams, maybe the number of Asian, words or phrases that include Asian have been increasing over the past year due to these very unfortunate and unpleasant experiences. And as unfortunate as these situations, these incidents were, I really hope as an East Asian, they can bring about some helpful changes to raise awareness, right? Because as some of you know, I think East Asians or Asians are often perceived as not just the model minority, but also the invisible minority. So hopefully some of the attention would be helpful, so that people are increasingly actually trying to understand the challenges Asians face, rather than just assuming they're doing completely fine. So I was chatting with Peter earlier that, for example, I saw just last week, John Oliver had a new episode just about Asian history. I think NBC had a couple of videos about anti-Asian issues as well. So hopefully these societal changes would bring about helpful progress.
Now, I guess, Michael, you mentioned that was the last question from last time, and we'd like to switch over to new questions from the audience.
Well, there's one more category. There's one more category.
Oh, there's one more category. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, go ahead.
So the next category is the more expansive category, which is other factors to study, beyond what we focused on, which was assertiveness. And a number of these questions are related. So I'm going to say the first two questions are quite closely related. From Wei Li, he says, could it be that the caste system in India is relevant? Maybe the early immigrants were from high castes who were connected to the top levels of society connected to that. And then Charlene Collins says, the Clinton administration gave out professional visas to South Asians disproportionately. So is it a selection phenomenon? Could that be part of what we're seeing, that there's just a different filter for immigration of South Asians than for immigration of East Asians? Any thoughts?
Good question. What I would say, I'll share a couple of thoughts first, and then Michael can add. What I would say is, I certainly think these, for example, selective migration can contribute to the career ceiling or the leadership discrepancy faced by East Asians versus South Asians. But for example, in our studies, right, where possible, we always controlled for socioeconomic status based on, for example, the salary or the parents' educational background or salary and so on. And we still see this leadership discrepancy even after statistically control for those factors. And in addition, just anecdotally, I think a lot of the prominent South Asian CEOs, they actually started as poor immigrants from India, right? If you read their biography. And so I think that's quite telling, suggesting that, this is not the socioeconomic status or caste system is probably not the most important factor here.
It's still, there have been some issues in Silicon Valley, like at Cisco recently, where people have argued that there's still caste discrimination going on in the United States. So it's certainly an issue still, but I don't think it's one of the primary drivers of what we're seeing. Now another question, which is another very interesting issue from Sandy Zhu, says anecdotal evidence seems to point to different levels of in-group favoritism. Some groups have a high proportion of appointing successors who are of the same ethnic group as themselves. Have you considered that? Many East Asians seem to have a very strong sense of fairness and do not participate as much in politics and are not as inclined to, assure that they have an in-group successor. Fascinating question. Jackson, what's your view?
I would say anecdotally, because the person, raised the anecdotal question, what I would say anecdotally, I've heard both sides of the story. I've heard people saying sort of East Asians, they have their ethnic homophily is too high. They always cluster together, have lunch together, right? Basically meaning too much in-group favoritism. But for example, as Sandy pointed out, there are other cases or contexts where the South Asians seem to be helping each other a lot. So the short answer is I don't have clear data to answer this question, but I think both could be possible. Any thoughts, Michael?
One of our next studies that we are, planning, and we are, making all the kinds of arrangements that we have to make to get the data from companies, is a data set where we're going to be looking at really multidimensional 360 performance evaluations that were done of executives across many industries and across many countries. And in that set of measurements, there are lots of measurements of what would go under the heading of political skills. And so we've just sort of taken peeks at the data, and we see some signs that South Asians do seem to have an advantage in this category of like political skills, so networking and sort of coalition building, that sort of thing. That they're perceived as good at that, and and so that might reflect that East Asians just don't have the same habit of doing it. It might reflect that East Asians have a distaste for it, that they have a sense of fairness and they're not as inclined to do that. I think it's an important part of the phenomenon and one that we hope to research. So
Yes.
now the next two questions about other factors, I'm going to put them together because I think they're kind of the same kinds of issues. Angela Chang asks, do East Asians and South Asians rate differently with regard to charisma? And then Sandy Shu says, have you looked at height? Given that there's evidence that among non-Asians that taller people are more likely to get promoted. So are any of our measurements, do we have any measurements related to height or charisma, Jackson?
In short, we don't. Although if you look at average height, if you just Google it, my impression is that the two sub-Asian groups, they don't differ meaningfully in terms of average height, right? We know, for example, the Dutch are very tall, but I don't think, for example, South Asians are particularly or significantly taller than East Asia. I could be wrong, but that's my impression.
That again may also be a generational thing. You know, I think like diets change, and the Dutch didn't used to be tall either, you know, but they've
Really?
grown.
Wow.
The average in the 20th century, the average Dutch height went from something like 5'9" to like 6'2" or something, whatever it is now, you know, whereas other groups didn't change. Okay, yeah, and charisma is a funny thing because it's hard to measure charisma. When organizational researchers try to measure charisma, what they find is that some of the things that correlate with the perception that, say, a politician is charismatic is the use of concrete perceptual detail in speeches. So people who paint a picture that's very vivid, like say Martin Luther King Jr., are regarded as very charismatic, but it's a, you know, it's a very specific phenomenon. It doesn't be, measurements of charisma don't correlate that highly with getting promoted. So it's, you know, I don't think charisma is as important as assertiveness, even though we kind of have this notion of leaders as needing to be charismatic. You know, a lot of CEOs are not particularly charismatic, but they just get the job done. Okay, other factors. Howard Wang says, you know, what about learning styles? And I think this is a great point. There are conventions in East Asia of educational systems that emphasize rote learning, in part because of I think the nature of the language, you know, that you have to memorize a lot of characters. Less emphasis on creative thinking and critical thinking. But for those raised in the US, it may be different. Jackson, do we have any data points relevant to this?
I would say this can certainly play a role, right, in the leadership attainment gap. Although, as I mentioned earlier, in our studies, when we look at even East Asians born and raised within the United States, we still see this leadership attainment gap, right, among the US-born East Asians and US-born South Asians, so suggesting that this is not perhaps the key reason here. And I mean, I agree with this person, the person who asked the question about sort of, you know, if you focus on learning through memorization and less creative thinking, I think that's in a way related to assertiveness, right? If, you know, you just want to be, you don't want to be the nail that gets hammered down, then, you know, because creative thinking is about disrupting convention, it's about breaking norms, right? So I think that goes similar with assertiveness, that you don't want to, you know, you want to conform to the norm and so on. So I think that's related. What do you think, Michael?
Well, you're kind of the expert on this. Jackson has actually done a number of really interesting studies on creativity, and one of the findings is that immigrants, you know, people who've lived in many countries, tend to be more creative than non-immigrants or people who don't have that same experience. So the people in our sample who are immigrants have that going for them, and then some of the people have been raised in the United States. So we know that learning styles is not the whole phenomenon, but there certainly is a difference in the educational systems. Okay, final question is Pete Su asks, how does the rise of the Chinese economy affect the leadership ceiling for East Asians in the United States? And I'll say one response to this is that there was an interesting article in the Economist, say about a decade ago, by some economists that argued that they sort of noticed that South Asians were doing really well in terms of CEO positions, whereas East Asians were not. And they suggested that it had to do with market forces, that there were with the boom of the Chinese economy, there were many opportunities for talented leaders and managers in China, whereas this was less so in India. So it might be that the fact that we see a lot of really successful South Asians here might reflect just that that the opportunities aren't there in their own country. Jackson?
I would make one point, which is from talking to a lot of, because we work with a lot of C-suite companies around the world. One thing worth considering for the two of you is this phenomenon of the Asian division of international companies.
Okay.
And an observation that a number of senior executives have made to me is there's good news and bad news for East Asians. The good news is because of the high growth in China and because of the movement to staff Chinese operations, not with expats who didn't have any cultural background, but with Chinese Americans and Chinese, created job opportunities for Chinese Americans. The dark side is, how did they ever get back to the headquarters, right? Mm-hmm. So that would be, I think if you do a little bit of analysis, it'd be very interesting to see whether there's this tragic combination of rapid promotion because you become the head of the Chinese branch of, GE something, but then the tragedy of you can't get back to headquarters, right? That would be interesting to see whether that actually is true.
It's like you become pigeonholed as the Asia expert, right? Because because first of all, you are of Asian heritage, and then you did well running that division, and then it doesn't occur to people that you should then become CEO.
Yeah, and I know one CEO who shall remain nameless, who is Chinese ethnically, who is CEO of a large public company, and he said basically he ran the Asia operations for a while. And he said the challenge was trying to get back to the headquarters and be respected as a headquarters executive. He made it, but he said it wasn't easy.
Right. It's a fascinating phenomenon because it's sort of like an opportunity that contains within it a pitfall or a potential trap. In organizations, there's a lot of such things. Companies tend to do what they're good at, and then that makes it very hard for them to change when the environment changes. And this is you're naturally pulled into a role. I think a lot of the African-American managers I know, there's a tremendous demand for them to start getting involved in diversity related things, but then they get seen as the diversity guy, rather than the accounting guy or the operations guy. So I think it's something to be very wary of.
Now we're approaching the end of the hour, and this has been wonderful because you have interspace between the questions from last time and the questions coming up. You've addressed many of them. As the host, I'd like the privilege of asking the last question, and that is this. In my family, there are 3 kids and we all did well. And one of the issues I want to raise is whether there are generational leadership practices or styles among Asian Americans that have a factor. In my family, my parents had a certain style, and very similar to their generation of Asian style. And embedded in that was, if you study hard, then you'll succeed. It doesn't matter. You don't want to run for student government or be in sports and so forth. The 3 kids, we all basically secretly defied that, and we secretly ran for student body officer, and we got onto varsity sports because we really didn't believe that their view was correct. That we felt that if we just followed them, maybe we'd get into a good college, but it wouldn't necessarily allow us to be successful long term. So we had a conspiracy, the 3 of us, to essentially defy our parents secretly, and then just present and say, well, I happen to be student body treasurer now, so I'm so sorry, right? So is some of that the case, a generational leadership style and generational priority that's embedded in kind of East Asian culture and generations, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, in our studies, like, one of our studies is about current CEOs. And so that's kind of your generation or older, right? You're a young CEO. Then we have studies of middle managers where we were able to partner with an organization and we surveyed all the middle managers that are East Asian or Asian of any kind, in the managerial ranks. And so those people are my generation and younger. And then we also had a number of studies focusing on current MBA students who are Jackson's generation, right? And we see this phenomenon in all those generations. So I think it hasn't, it may have evolved, but it hasn't disappeared generationally.
Yeah.
Jackson, you want to have the last word?
Sure. I would say really fascinating practice in your family. I'm glad you secretly, had this coalition. I think to maybe the point of some audience comments, right? So another way to perhaps increase your certainty and confidence is to practice these student activities, student governance, competitive sports like soccer, basketball. So I think those could all really help, for example, East Asians or Asians more involved and become more visible in general, right? And one thing we haven't exactly studied, but I think certainly plays a role, is the role of role models, which is to say, if you increasingly see other East Asians, whether it's Andrew Yang or other prominent figures, being the head of an organization or society or some groups, then you might be thinking, I could be like that, right? Was this person's story? So you have something to aspire to look up to. So, and I hope that day will come soon.
Well, I want to end by saying again, a fabulous discussion and answers to questions. I do think I'm going to call up Netflix and recommend that the two of you have a Netflix show and people can binge watch. Those of you who are here, this is being recorded, so like the one for April 27th, it's going to be available if you want to watch it over and over again. But I do encourage all of you to attend the ones in the future. We have different topics. And the good news is Jackson Liu and Michael Morris will be two of the discussion leaders at the July 17th. The only problem is there are only 8 seats per table, so we're going to have to have a waiting list, but they are going to participate in that event. So I want to thank again, a great thanks to the two professors for a fabulous job, and we look forward to your continued future research. And it's just fascinating what the data shows. Not always, some intuitive, some not intuitive, but all informative. So thank you very much. And I want to thank all the audience for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.